Disney's Cruella, a novelization. Chapter 9. As Estella's tenure with the House of Baroness advanced, the days began to fall into a comfortable routine, or as comfortable as possible when one worked for a ruthless fashion designer who was prone to outbursts of anger and easily frustrated. Estella woke early and got to the warehouse before the others arrived, and from that moment until lunch, Estella was lost in her own world, sketching, designing, sewing, and mending. Every day brought a new bolt of fabric, a new spark of inspiration. And then, just when Estella's stomach began to grumble, the Baroness made an appearance in the workroom. On the plus side, it usually scared away Estella's hunger, as the designers were encouraged to eat on their own time. On the downside, one could never guess what type of mood the Baroness would be in. Some days, she was cold, which was her version of nice. Other days, she was icy, and still others, she was downright arctic. Still, as long as the woman kept inspiring her and offering her ways to improve, Estella would gladly take the moods. So the days went on, and while she was never less than exhausted when she returned to the lair each night, Estella had never been happier. One late morning, Estella was just about to put the last touches on a design she had been sketching, when she heard the unmistakable click of the Baroness's heels outside of the workroom. Putting down her pen, she stood at attention. She glanced at the clock. It was 11:30 a.m. Yes, it was almost time for the Baroness to send someone for her lunch. A moment later, the Baroness appeared. As always, Geoffrey stood by her side. Her eyes traveled around the room and then stopped on Estella. "Grubby girl," she said. Estella looked down at her clothes. Did she mean her? But she had just cleaned her outfit the night before, although her hands, she realized, were stained with ink. "Go get me lunch." The Baroness went on to place an impossible order for even the most seasoned of servers. Estella listened closely, trying to remember every detail. There were cucumber slices cut a certain width, a particular number of parsley sprigs, and the express direction for them to be shredded, not torn. When the Baroness was done, Estella nodded and quickly left. She needed to get the food before she forgot. Luckily, the Baroness frequented the restaurant, so they were used to her particular style of ordering, and didn't bat an eye when Estella articulated the order. She waited, growing nervous as the time seemed to drag. The Baroness hated to be kept waiting. When the food was finally finished, Estella raced back to the warehouse and bustled upstairs. She stopped in front of the office door. It was open, but there were two men inside speaking to the Baroness. Her face was a mask. Estella hesitated. "As the department stores that stock your range," one of the men was saying, "we thought perhaps we could give you some input." The other man, wearing a suit, an expression identical to his companion's, nodded in agreement. "Feedback." The Baroness raised one perfectly plucked eyebrow. "Great," she said. The two men started to relax, but then she went on. "I'll start. My feedback. You're short, you're fat, you smell like an anchovy, and are colorblind and pretend you aren't." The shorter of the two men shifted nervously in his seat, and Estella could have sworn he tried to smell himself. The Baroness turned to the other man. "Your revenues are down 12.5%. Foot traffic down 15%. The man looked surprised to hear the figures. "Yes, I do my own research." "Your store hasn't been refurbished since the Blitz. People aren't sure whether to buy or duck and cover." Estella listened with a mixture of fear and fascination. She had never heard anyone speak in such a bold and confident way, let alone a woman. It was brilliant to watch, though Estella would never want to be at the other end of the lashing. The Baroness wasn't done. "Most of the money meant for upgrades is being embezzled by you, stashing it in a Swiss bank." She rattled off the exact account number as the men's faces paled. "Great! I'm done," she finally said, her tone satisfied as she sat back in her chair. "Your turn! I'm all ears." Quickly the men got to their feet. "Good day," the taller one managed to mutter before he turned and hightailed it out of the office. The other followed suit. As they brushed past Estella, she was almost sure she heard one of them sniffling. Just then the Baroness looked up. "Lunch!" she said, all vestiges of the previous exchange apparently forgotten. "Now!" Estella hurried over and handed the Baroness her meal. She just hoped that it hadn't grown cold, or that the 7 sprigs of shredded, not torn, parsley hadn't wilted in the meantime. Leaning over, the Baroness examined her food as closely as she examined a design. Then she nodded. "Finally," she said, "someone competent." Estella blushed at the compliment and was about to say thank you when there was a sound from the doorway. Turning, she watched a young man trip into the room. The Baroness sighed. "And someone not," she said. To Estella's surprise, the Baroness continued to address her directly. "This is Roger, my lawyer, although he spends most of his time playing piano in a dingy bar." "Hi," Roger said, lifting a hand filled with papers in greeting. "Hi," Estella said. Then when she realized she should say something more, she added, "Piano's nice." Ignoring both of them, the Baroness picked 2 cucumbers from her lunch, and lying down on the chaise lounge in the corner of her office, she put them on her eyes. "Time for my 9-minute power nap," she said. "Estella, box up my lunch." "She knows my name," Estella thought, as she quickly did as she was told. She hadn't heard the Baroness call any of the other women or men in the workroom by their real names. What could it mean? Had something just shifted? Placing the rest of the food back in its container, Estella turned back to the Baroness. "Right," she said, just as Roger said, "Could I just—" But neither of them got a response. The Baroness was out cold. Exchanging looks, Estella and Roger slowly crept out of the room. Estella knew the saying, "Never wake a sleeping bear or risk its claws." If she had just had what could be considered, well, a moment with the Baroness, she wasn't going to risk a thing. Estella was nervous. While the Baroness had continued to throw her scraps of attention, Estella was never sure when the attention might end. It made every request, every moment, every sketch fraught with tension. That morning was no different. Walking onto the balcony outside her office right before lunch, the Baroness had told, or rather ordered, Estella to go with her. Moments later, Estella had found herself sitting in the back of the Baroness's car. Nodding at the sketchbook Estella always carried with her, the Baroness had told her to rework an older sketch. Relaxing back against the plush leather on the seat opposite Estella, the Baroness began to eat her lunch while Estella worked. As they moved along the city streets, the car bounced over a pothole. The Baroness apparently personally offended by the condition of the streets. Her glance landed on the sketch pad in Estella's lap. "Maybe it needs a lining," she said. Estella cocked her head. That was an idea. "Could use some tulle to puff it out," she suggested, building off of the Baroness's thought. "Give it some body?" The Baroness nodded and took one last bite of her lunch, then threw the rest of it out the window. Catching Estella's surprised look, the Baroness shrugged. "For the neighbors," she said. "They hate me. Working woman. New money. So if they hate me anyway, I'll give them a reason." Spotting the gates to Ipswich Manor, she sat up. "Ah, here we are," she said. As the car moved through a huge set of gates and up to the manor, Estella's eyes widened. On either side were immaculate plantings without a flower or leaf out of place. Even the gravel on the drive seemed to have been evened out so there was not a bump to be felt. But that all paled in comparison to the huge mansion. It had dozens of windows and was a full floor higher than any of the surrounding homes. Coming out the doors to greet them was a line of servants. As the car stopped, The Baroness waved away the offer for a hand from her driver. She ignored the servants too, and walked straight into the house, dropping gloves and her hat as she went. The two bodyguards, who were never far away, stayed close while a trio of Dalmatians bolted up to the Baroness, barking eagerly for attention. She ignored them. Behind her, Estella struggled to keep up, her eyes glued on the dogs. She normally considered herself a dog person, but Dalmatians did not count. Not since the night 3 of them had killed her mother. Eyeing the 3 standing beside the Baroness now, Estella forced down a wave of nausea. They continued to sweep through the mansion, not stopping until they arrived at the Baroness's bedchambers. The room was bigger than the entire design space at the warehouse. The ceilings were 20 feet high, and the walls were covered in rich paper. Under her feet, the rug was plush. Stopping in front of a full-length mirror, the Baroness waited as 2 of her maids entered and began to dress her. She stood like a living mannequin, her expression bored as she was tucked and shoved into her dress. Estella began to sketch in her pad, taking inspiration from her surroundings as a new dress took shape on the page. "Stella!" The Baroness's voice startled Estella, and she flipped back to the image she had been sketching in the car. "The bodice. Maybe pencil thin. Jules!" The Baroness turned her commanding voice to address John, her valet, ordering him to retrieve her priceless accessories. The man moved toward the far wall of the room. He pushed on the wall, and a secret door slid open, revealing another locked door behind that. The guard pulled out a key and unlocked the door, then disappeared inside. "Did you do pencil thin?" the Baroness asked, returning her attention to Estella. Estella nodded but didn't answer, focusing on refining the design. A moment later, the valet reappeared from the hidden room with a tray of sparkling jewels in his hands. The Baroness stepped off the pedestal she had been standing on and walked over. Absently, she rifled through the diamonds and sapphires, rubies and emeralds. She pushed aside a few smaller pieces before finally picking a diamond set that included a necklace, earrings, and a huge ring. "All right," she said, presenting herself to the room. "How do I look?" "Fabulous!" everyone in the room replied without hesitation. The Baroness seemed barely to register the canned compliment. "Estella," she said, "show me." Quickly, Estella made her way over. Holding out the sketch pad, she showed the woman the design she had dictated. The Baroness nodded curtly. "How would you have done it?" Estella paused. She was unsure what to say. Did the Baroness actually want Estella to contradict her design, or was this a trap? After a moment's thought, Estella took a risk and made some quick amendments to the design, handing it over with bated breath. The Baroness stared at the paper for a long moment. "I think you're something," the Baroness finally said. Then, without another word, she turned and left the room, her minions following.